Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Off-Farm Income Podcast. Hey, thank you so much for joining us here on our YouTube channel for episode number 1047, everybody. Well, we're doing something a little bit different today. A gentleman who is a friend of the show named Warren Clark from AgPR Media, he had reached out to me and let me know about a young lady who had reached out to him wanting to know about starting an agricultural podcast. And he referred her over to me for some advice on how to get that done. Well, rather than just having a private conversation with her and telling her how I got started and how to get this going, I thought this is a great opportunity to record something and put something out there for all of you who, as your form of off-farm income, you might be interested in creating your own agricultural podcast or any podcast for that matter. And so on today's episode, that is exactly what we are going to be doing. So I'm going to be doing just a small bit of interviewing with Ashley Elsbernd as part of our Friday edition episode. And then she is going to be interviewing me about starting a podcast. And hopefully we provide you with some very helpful information. We're going to get that started for you right now. Ashley, welcome to the show. Hey, thank you so much for coming on today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. This is going to be an experimental episode. We're doing something kind of like we've never done before, but it's exciting to me. A, because I love to talk about myself. I'm a complete narcissist in that way. But B, to be able to profile how to become a podcaster and all of that to my audience as one of our Friday Business Edition episodes, I think that's exciting. It is I would have never thought this before, but it is a valid form of off-farm income. It's a valid business to start and do, and we need more people in ag doing this. So I really appreciate it. And I want to give a little bit of background to our audience about what's going on before we dive in too deep. So Warren Clark, who's a friend of the show, he introduced the two of us. You had been in touch with him regarding some of your ideas in ag, and you, as an FFA student, you are interested in beginning a podcast to profile the stories of FFA students. Do I have that part right?
Yes, I'm going to try using it to spotlight some of our different FFA members and what they're doing with their FFA experience in their high school time.
Okay, perfect. So this will be done for your chapter, it sounds like.
Yes, but I'm hoping to make it a little bit more diverse when it gets bigger.
Okay, so you want to grow it, and that'll be the seed that it sprouts from. So very good. So I am happy to help out. And, you and I could have had a conversation off the air where I could have given you my advice and told you how to do this or how I created mine. But why not do it on the air and share it with everybody? To me, I think that's a superior idea. So let's get you introduced to the audience. Tell us what grade you're in, what chapter, FFA chapter you come from.
I am a junior at the South Winneshiek FFA chapter in Kelmer, Iowa.
Okay, Kelmer, Iowa. And now everybody who's out there looking that up, I would spell Kelmer with a K and an E, but it's almost spelled like calamari without the ARI at the end. That's exactly how it's spelled. That's how I do it. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So how long have you been part of the FFA then?
I have been in FFA since I was a freshman, and I have been an officer for the last 3 years.
Okay. So what position are you currently holding?
I am currently the reporter for the chapter.
Okay. Very good. So you're serving as the reporter, and then what other positions have you had?
My sophomore year, I was the chapter secretary. Last year, I was the chapter president, and this year I decided I wanted to be a bit more in social media, so I became the reporter.
So you're in social media. And so what social media outlets are you using to tell the story of Winneshiek?
In past years, we have had a Facebook page that has been our primary source. This year, I'm going to try growing more of an Instagram page to reach younger generation. I'm going to try strengthening our FFA page and FFA Facebook page and give more information on that, and hopefully build a website for our different advertising of products that we sell.
Oh, wow. That's so product sales and everything. So you're going to be building and working into e-commerce and all sorts of stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm hoping so.
Okay. Well, it sounds like a great idea for your chapter, but man, it also sounds like you're going to build some skills that are going to be really marketable. So that is very exciting. Now, this is I don't normally do an FFA interview on Fridays as we're releasing this one, but since we're going to be talking about building a business, we're placing this on a Friday. So this is kind of a hybrid interview. We're talking a little bit about you and your time in the FFA, and then we'll talk more about building a podcasting business. But so you're building some really interesting skills, and it sounds like you've got some very specific interest areas. What are you thinking about doing after high school? Because I mean, you're almost done with your junior year right now, and then you got 1 year left. So what's next?
Even though I'm building all of these skills, I've been looking into veterinary medicine.
Okay.
So we're kind of going completely off the ball on that one.
Okay. Well, look, I can tell. So two things. A, I started out pre-vet. I went to college at Montana State University, started pre-vet, and I was not smart enough to pull that off. So I wound up with the lowest level option in an animal science degree, and I barely squeaked that out. But I can already tell just by looking at you on camera and talking to you that you are far brighter than me. So your vet school will be no problem for you. But with that said, even a veterinarian is a business owner, right? I mean, you could go to work for somebody else, and that's very true. But if you ultimately have your own practice, you're a business owner. You need to market that business. You need to understand business. And so there's a place here for how that fits in, right? Okay. All right. Well, let's do this. So we know a little bit about you now, but the point of this kind of experimental interview or this experimental episode today is that you are going to be asking me about how in the world do you get this podcast going, and you can ask me about all your goals with it and what you want to do with it and all that type of stuff. And I will let you just kind of take it away with some questions, okay?
Okay. To start this off, I kind of wanted to just ask you what got you into podcasting, or like what big step brought you to this idea of it?
Yeah, the big step for me was I was working in a career that was no longer the right fit for me, and I wanted out of it, and I wanted the lifestyle of somebody who lives rural on a farm and who is an entrepreneur. I wanted that freedom, and I could not for the life of me figure out how to make that happen. And you're not faced with this yet, but at the time I was doing that, I had a house, I had a wife, I had a daughter, I had house payments, I had all these adult things that I had to deal with, and I could not figure out how to get that done. And so it became a little bit depressing because I really knew what I wanted, but it felt like I was never going to be able to get there. But I kept just trying to figure out how to make it happen. And through that process, I listened to a lot of podcasts and a lot of inspirational people out there. Some people who provided me with information to help me figure out how to do it. Some people who provided me with reassurance that it was possible, and some people that provided me with inspiration that I could get it done. And I consumed a lot of podcasts. And then one day happened, I finally actually made it happen. My wife and I, we bought a farm. We started a business. The business went really well. As the business grew, I left that career that was no longer a fit for me. I was a police officer back then for 15 years, and I left that career that was no longer a fit for me. And I found myself one day sitting on my farm, my own farm, or I should say our farm, but this had been like a 20-year goal for me. And I'm sitting here on the farm. I own my own business. My time belongs to me. And it was a really inspirational moment that I thought was never going to happen. And I thought, man, I want to start a podcast to tell other people how I did this, because there was a time where I was depressed. I didn't think I could make it happen. And here it had happened. And so I wanted to share that message with people. And of course, I was an entrepreneur at the moment. And so I thought, well, I want to do this. I want to share this with people, but I don't want to do it just, for the sake of doing it. I want this to be part of my business. And so I came up with a business plan in a way that I thought I could turn this into an actual business. And in a lot of ways, we've followed that path, and it's gone like I expected. But in a lot of other ways, things happen that were unexpected. But now it's turned out to be my full-time business.
So when you were very first starting off, how did you pick your topic? Did you just want to get more information out about agriculture, or just kind of show a different side of it? What was your plan when you originally started it?
So I have never thought that I have got the type of personality that people will purposely tune into to listen. So I kind of ruled that out. I listen, I'm like everybody else. I go to movies, I listen to radio, podcasts, of course. I read books, watch television, all that type of stuff, right? And I never looked at those people who could compel people to consume their content because they were just so interesting. And I never looked at those people and thought, okay, that's me. So that was never, ever the goal. So if I wasn't that person, I had to come up with a reason that would compel people to listen. And so I had heard about getting involved in a niche. And this became really, really important to me. And so basically what I decided was I was going to be so specialized in what I talked about that people would be forced to listen to me. They wouldn't do it because they liked me, but they would have no other option, because if they wanted to know about a specific thing, I was going to be the only voice out there talking about it, meaning I was their only option. And so in a microeconomics world of supply versus demand, if there was demand for the topic I was talking about, there was only going to be one source of supply, and that was going to be me. And that turned out to be a more powerful thing than I had initially expected. That was the way I thought that I could offer something of value to people because they couldn't find it anywhere else. But it turned out that when you get involved in a niche that deep, and my niche was exactly what I had done. I had started a very, very small agricultural service business, and then I had used that to become a full-time entrepreneur. And so I wanted to interview owners of very, very small agricultural service businesses, and so tell other people's story, and including mine. And what happened was I had this really small niche, but then all of a sudden I became one of the voices in agriculture in this particular niche. And because people were listening to me, because there was nowhere else for them to go to hear about a guy with a gopher extermination business, or to hear about a guy with a mobile sawmill, or a guy with a mobile seed cleaning business, or a manure spreading business. There was just nobody else doing shows about this. All of a sudden, it advanced me well beyond the level of expertise or experience that I had, because I was a trusted voice, because if somebody needed to know about this topic, it brought them right to me.
Okay, that makes sense. So when you very first started this, how did you start off your first episode? I know there's a lot of different ways to start it off, with just jumping right into your topic,
Mm-hmm.
or by kind of giving a rundown on what you think it is. What did you do for your very first episode, and how did you advertise that?
Okay. So the very first episode, so just to let you know, so when you record a podcast, especially one by yourself, you sit down in your own studio, whatever that may be. I don't have a fancy studio. I'm just got a room in my house that I use. And I sat down in a room by myself. I was about to record my first podcast, which I could very well go, well, that was a bad idea, and never release it. And nobody in the world would ever know about it. And I was still red-faced and sweating and embarrassed. And it wasn't live. Nobody knew I was doing this but me and my wife. And it was not live. And I was still embarrassed. And I experienced something that people call imposter syndrome. And basically what imposter syndrome is who am I to do this? Why do I deserve to do this? Or, look at the big ego on Matt. He thinks that he can make a podcast and people will listen. Who does he think he is? That type of thing. And so with that in mind, I figured my very first episode needed to be just me, and I needed to provide a baseline that would be there for eternity. And episode 1 is there for, as far as I know, eternity. And it explains what the show's about, who I am, why I'm qualified to talk about this, what my experiences have been, and what my goal is with the show. So for me, my very first episode ever, no guest, no topical information, just information of, here's what you're going to get on this show. Here's why I have credibility to talk about it. And here's what I want you to know when you're done listening. And just to set the stage.
So would you recommend all starting podcasts take that route, where you do have that baseline episode to kind of explain themselves and give themselves that credibility?
Yeah, I do. I did another podcast about a year and a half ago called Microphone Money. I did 43 episodes and kind of capped it off. And it was all about teaching people how to develop a podcasting business like I had done. And I do suggest that when I consult, for my clients or when I coach people on becoming podcasters, I always recommend that. And now that process is getting a little bit more refined. People are doing like preview episodes, so they're not calling it episode 1. They're calling it like a preview or something like that. But everybody is doing some form of, here's what this show's about, here's why you should listen to me, and here's what the goal is. Yeah.
Okay. So this new podcast that you started, brand new thing, and you said only you and your wife knew about it. How did you get the news out about it, and how did you build your podcast to be such a strong pillar of information and communication amongst people?
Oh, wow. Thanks for that compliment. My goodness. So really, I just started putting it out. The very first thing I did is I just put it out. I created a Facebook page, so I did that, a Facebook business page. I did invite, which by the way, this is something I regret. This is something I wouldn't do again. I did invite all of my personal contacts on Facebook to like my business page. And I know that's a valid method of growing the page, but of all of those personal contacts I had on Facebook, maybe 3% of them were interested in agriculture. And I don't like it when, I shouldn't say I don't like it, because I know my wife's aunt is going to be listening to this episode. I That's too strong of a word. I was going to say I don't like it when my friends or family listen to my show just out of loyalty to me, just to do something nice for me. Because if they don't get it or if they don't understand it, they're not involved in agriculture. I don't want them to think that I do a lousy show because it's not their topic, if that makes sense. But I worded that too strong. So Annadelle, I'm sorry. What I meant to say is just, it is definitely, doing this since 2014, I've lost all that embarrassment. Now I'm very, very comfortable doing this right up until the moment that a friend or a family member comes up to me and they go, "Hey, I listened to your show," and I know they're not into ag. And I go, "Oh my goodness, what did I say? What did I do?" I start going over the episodes and wondering if I stuck my foot in my mouth and all of that. But anyway, I did invite those friends and family to start growing it. And then what I found was my method for finding guests for the show was really difficult. It's still difficult for the Friday edition, what we're doing today. But back then, my only method that I knew to do, and I think my only option, was I would go on Craigslist in all sorts of different towns all over the United States. So, like, if Calmer, Iowa had in a Craigslist page, I'd go to the Calmer, Iowa Craigslist page, and I would look at farm and ranch services, and I would try and find these small little businesses that people were advertising on Craigslist, and then I would find one that fit, and I would call them. I would invite them to be a guest on the show. Well, about 8 out of 10 people, maybe 9 out of 10 people thought I was some sort of a scammer or a telemarketer when I called them and I invited them to be a guest on my podcast. So I had to make a lot of calls, and unwittingly, what ended up happening was a lot of these people were checking out my show because they wanted to know if I was a liar or a scammer or something like that. And it started generating downloads. And then there's kind of a snowball effect or a positive cycle where you start generating those downloads. And some people keep listening. Some people share it because I was talking about things that would be of interest to these folks. And it kind of grew organically that way. And then about 6 months into it, I started interviewing FFA students about their entrepreneurial ventures. And so I was calling a lot of FFA advisors and asking for interviews with their students. And then now you got students listening to their own show. You had their parents, their relatives, their FFA advisors. Word spread a little bit and word spread a little bit more. And then over time, for the most part, I think the biggest piece of growth is just word of mouth. It's just getting it out there. And then people saying, "Hey, I listened to the show and this would be of interest to you." And to me, I think that's probably the biggest source of growth. But initially, it was just good old fashioned phone calls, reaching out to people, and just letting it kind of just build.
Okay. Um, when you first started this, you said you weren't prepared. You had very little experience with it before. what did you first start out using? Like what technology, what different platforms did you use, and how did you grow that to what you have now?
Well, actually, it's really a good question. Back then, there were a couple experts out there who were just way on the front end of podcasting. So, and they're still out there. I don't mean to say they're gone, but there was a guy named Cliff Ravenscraft, and he had branded himself as the quote unquote podcast answer man. And he basically said, look, if you're going to start a podcast, here's the equipment you need. And he actually sold it as an affiliate on his website as a package deal. So I looked at what was in his package deal, decided what I needed, and I bought those three things. So initially, I spent I spent about $2,500 to start my podcast. So what I bought a mixer, an audio mixer, like the kind that a band would use, not one that was designed specifically for podcasting. But they really didn't have those at that point in time because I was kind of early into it. I bought a digital recorder to capture all my audio on, and I bought an Audio Technica microphone. You could pick those up for like $55 or $60. And they're pretty good mics. I still have two, and when I have people in the studio, I use them here in the studio for guests. And so and sometimes going remote. So they're pretty good mics, honestly, for that price. So I did that. And then I knew every Windows-based computer I'd ever had that I put large amounts of data onto crashed and had tons of problems. So I said, well, I'm going to buy a Mac. This is my biggest part of my investment. So I bought a MacBook Pro. That was about $1,400. So all in all, I spent about $2,500 when you got all the cables and all of that. And I just started. And that's what I started with. And then and that, by the way, that's plenty. You could these days you could do it for far less, by the way. And maybe I went overboard then too. But anyway, that was plenty. I did all of my editing and producing on GarageBand, which is the software for that, which comes on a Mac, and I still use that. And got to know that and still use that. And so that was plenty of tech. A couple years later, I got a contract with a company called D&B Supply, which is a farm and ranch retailer that's based out here where I live, where I was going to host a radio show and a podcast for them. And they offered to upgrade my mic for me as part of that contract. So they bought me a Heil PR40, which is a really, really good mic. They bought me that one, which is a huge upgrade for me. That's what I'm using today. And then just like 2 weeks ago, I finally changed out my mixer to a more podcast-specific mixer, one with a USB output, which turns out to be a really big deal. And so I finally have come into the times. But I've been using that other mixer, made by Mackie, since 2014, right up until about 2 weeks ago.
Okay. So for students like me that are just starting out, if you had to pick one of those several things that you started out with, what was the most beneficial one that you would suggest getting?
Probably that Audio Technica mic. And the reason I say that is it's a USB mic, so you can plug it right into your computer, and then you can use free software. If you don't have a Mac, let's say you have a PC, there's free software out there, Adobe Audition, that you can use. And a lot of people, I know very professional radio producers in satellite radio who use Adobe Audition, their free edition, and they use that to put together professional satellite radio shows. So it's really good. So you could record directly into your computer and you would have that good audio with the mic. So I would say the mic would be, if you, let's say you only had $100 budget, I'd start with that mic.
Okay. Kind of moving more over to your FFA interview. With me becoming hopefully interviewing some more of our FFA members, are there different parts of SAEs that you emphasize more on, or some SAEs that you try to avoid?
Yeah, there's no SAEs I try to avoid, but since my show has always been about small business, what led me to interviewing FFA students was when I found out about entrepreneurship SAEs. And so you had this population of 700,000 plus students out there, with a ton of them choosing entrepreneurship for their supervised agricultural experiences. And so what initially happened was I spoke with the FFA advisors at our local high school, at Kuna High School, where I live here in Idaho. And they told me about these idea cards that the FFA has for sale for chapters, where students can go through these idea cards and they can get ideas to start an SAE. But it's for all three categories: research, placement, and then of course entrepreneurship. And so they let me borrow those, and I brought them home and I looked through them, and there were some great ideas in there. And that's where everything stopped. There was no follow up on those ideas. It was like, start a landscape business. Okay, where are the instructions on how you start a landscape business? They weren't there. It was just simply that little seed of an idea. And so I thought, man, that's interesting. So I started looking into it deeper. I discovered proficiency awards. I discovered American Star Awards, and in agribusiness, Star Farmers, things like that. And my mind was blown by what these students were doing. I mean, there were students in high school in the FFA who were currently running and operating the business that I had hoped to start with my very first business. They were blowing me out of the water. And so that inspired me to start interviewing FFA students specifically about entrepreneurship SAEs. Now, over the years, I've expanded that at certain points in time, like every fall. I try to interview every single American Star finalist. And so, of course, there's going to be 4 in agri-science research. There's going to be 4 in placement. And so those 8 interviews get a little bit outside the scope. But man, at that level, those students have so much to offer. What they've done is incredible. So it's very worthwhile to have them on the show. And it's never not worthwhile to have a student outside of an entrepreneurship SAE on the show. It's just that I've tried to stay within kind of the boundaries I defined of that niche of entrepreneurship. But there's certainly nothing I avoid. I'm just geared towards entrepreneurship.
Okay. Is there certain aspects of the SAE that you have your students explain more? Like, how do they handle their animals? How do they get a hold of the equipment they need for that? Is there something that you try emphasizing their explanation on?
I think when I first started, there was, I have a format and a set of questions that I'll send to students ahead of time so they can kind of prep. And I used to really follow those questions to a T. But now I kind of let the conversation go where the conversation goes. And I think that's just me evolving as an interviewer. But the one thing I always want to know the origin. Where did the idea come from? How did they come up with the idea? And then how did they fund it? How did they get it going? And you hear a lot of different answers on that, even in high school. Sometimes students are taking out debt. Sometimes students, they've been raising livestock and they've put that money back in. Matter of fact, it is amazing the maturity of FFA students. How many FFA students make good money through their entrepreneurship SAE, and they take it and they put it all right back into the business and they grow their business. And there's a lot of adult entrepreneurs starting small businesses that don't understand that and don't do that. And it's amazing to see that. But I always like to know the origin. I want to know where the idea came from. And what I found over time is that it's amazing to see what's possible when somebody like a high school student who doesn't have anything to lose comes up with an idea and gives it a try. Because as you get into adulthood and you're facing all these other realities, you might come up with a great idea, but you'll talk yourself right out of it because how am I going to make the house payment? What about health insurance? Blah, 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 all this adult stuff. But then you interview these students who said, why not try it? What do I have to lose? Which is true. They had nothing to lose. And it turns into something amazing. And I love to get those origins and to see where that all came from.
I think that just about finishes up all of my questions.
That's it. My goodness. What about monetizing?
Monetizing? I don't even know what that is.
Okay, well, let me ask you a couple questions. So, do you have a name for what this podcast is going to be at South Winneshiek yet?
I just officially came up with what my topics were going to be the other day.
Okay.
I have no idea what this name's going to be.
What are your topics going to be?
I'm going to try interviewing an FFA member, kind of similar to your podcast, at least once a week, and maybe try bringing different aspects of agriculture into it, like maybe bringing one of the kids in our FFA that works primarily with beef and see what his farm does different from what swine workers do.
Okay. And what's your goal with the show? What do you want your listeners to know when they're done listening to an episode?
With this being a school-based podcast, I figured a lot of the family members of the people in the FFA are going to be the ones listening to it.
Okay.
So I would love to have more SAEs known for like younger generations when they're coming into FFA,
Okay.
but also with the amount of people getting away from agriculture and how many generations removed we have been from agriculture. I'd love to use this podcast to educate our small rural town to see if maybe those small misconceptions about agriculture can be corrected by this podcast of a bunch of students.
Okay. And why just your small rural town? You realize that when you publish your podcast, when it goes out into the world, it's going to be on Apple Podcasts, it's going to be on Spotify, it's going to be on Google Play and YouTube and all these areas. There's going to be people all over the world that hear
And that's a little terrifying, I'm not going to lie. But the smaller I start, I feel the bigger I can grow it. So the more I try aiming these small misconceptions in my rural area and then grow it to bigger areas and bigger misconceptions and bigger areas of people that don't understand fully, I think that would be a good baseline starting point on how to start getting the right amount of information out.
Okay. Well, it's interesting that the worldwide or the interstate exposure scares you. It's really just those people in the small town that can walk up to you and go, "Man, you really laid an egg on that podcast." Those people who live 5 states away, they're never going to see
Yeah.
you.
I've kind of gotten over the fear of having my friends just kind of
Okay.
judge me. They all give me insults no matter what.
Okay. So monetization is how you make money from a podcast. And now that may not be your ultimate goal, and I totally get that. But you did mention that as part of what you're doing with the website there for your FFA chapters, you're selling products, right? So there is a revenue generation component to the other things you're doing in FFA. Do I have that right?
Our chapter has been selling more services than products, but yes, to some degree. Yes.
Okay. And that revenue generation, I'm assuming, is to help pay for things like probably going to state conventions, going to CDEs, maybe jackets for students, maybe even things like the Washington Leadership Conference or National Convention. Do I have that right? Is it supporting the FFA activities for your fellow chapter members?
Like you kind of said with your other SAE members, we try using our services and what we sell to go back into the FFA for how we can fund different,
Okay.
um, not vacations, different conferences and stuff. But we also try using it to build up our business more and try funding different technology that can make more services for us later on.
Okay. So monetization is when you turn something like this podcast or a website or a blog or whatever, when you turn that into something that generates revenue for you. Okay. So it's just revenue generation. It's just a fancy word for that. And so that's a big part of starting a podcast business, at least in my mind. Now, there are people who make podcasts purely for the art of doing it. They just have something to say, they're interested in something, and they love the medium. And there's absolutely zero problem with that. But for my show and what we talk about forms of off-farm income, and podcasting has turned into my form of off-farm income. This is my only business now. And so I had to learn how to monetize, how to make money from doing this. And so if you're going to be selling services on your website, so you have a component of what you're doing at your FFA chapter that's geared towards generating revenue to support the different activities in the FFA. Well, if you're going to go to all the trouble to make a podcast anyway, you might as well try and monetize that. So that's why I was asking you about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Okay. So just some things to think about. One, I've got advertisers on the show. And of course, everybody that hears my show 6 days a week, they know about lacrosse footwear and Powder River livestock handling equipment. So I've got advertisers on the show. But that was kind of a bonus. That was never something that I expected to be a revenue generating source for me. So that was kind of like a cherry on top of things. My business model for me personally has always been developing my name through the podcast, sharing good information and helping people, and having that lead me into opportunities like hosting other shows, going and doing speaking events and things like that. That was always the model. The advertising is a bonus, but for you, as you describe what you've got in mind, and you're going to be, even though people in other states and other countries will listen to your show, you're going to be very centered or focused on your local community. You will be wanting to look at what they call the analytics or the statistics about who's listening to your show. And if you're really focusing it on your local area, then you'll want to look at those audience numbers. And if a large percentage of your audience numbers are coming out of your, out of Winneshiek or excuse me, out of Kalmar or that area, then you might be able to sell local advertising on your podcast. It doesn't have to be for a ton of money, but it could be every episode makes you $100 or $150 or something like that. Or if you get really good, maybe a lot more than that. And that money could be going right back into your chapter. And it's not what we traditionally refer to as passive income, but it kind of is, because you're going to be doing the podcast anyway. So if you've created something that has value to other people, then all of a sudden maybe you can generate some revenue through that. So that's what I mean by monetizing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay. Are you feeling pressure to come up with more questions?
I'm just trying to think of what other things there is that I'm wondering. Like, it's difficult thinking of questions on how to start a business when you have no idea where you're going with it.
Absolutely. Well, and you're experiencing the growing pangs of somebody who's going to be doing interviews, because we can run into those situations, right, where we run out of questions and we're like, I'm drawing a blank. I do not know where to go next. And so sometimes that's a natural place for the interview to end. Sometimes you edit that part out and you kind of reset. You come up with some more questions, and just a classic question that I will end an interview with, especially if it's complex. I'll get to the end and I'll ask my guest, hey, is there anything about your business, or is there anything about your project or whatever that may be that you want the world to know that I have not asked you about? And I just hit the ball right over to their side of the court. And so that can be very, very helpful to get an important piece of information in that you might have otherwise missed because you get caught up in the moment and kind of the adrenaline of doing the interview and being on the spot and all of that. So that's great. Okay, so you need a good podcast name.
Yeah.
You really do. And a lot of people, when they think of a business name, they think of a podcast name, whatever that may be, they just default to the most obvious thing out there. So the most obvious thing out there for you, I would think, would be the Winneshiek or South Winneshiek FFA podcast, right?
Yeah.
And I get that, but what if it was, gosh, I don't know. If you wanted to be really community based, what if it was titled the Kalmar, Iowa Agricultural Journey? Or I'm just spitting stuff out here, but you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You want to draw community members in. You want to pique their interest. Somebody gets on the internet that's never heard of a podcast, and they do a search for Kalmar, Iowa, and all of a sudden this thing pops up, and it's a profile of an FFA project. Like, what is this? Why is this about my hometown? Versus they may never see the South Winneshiek FFA podcaster or something like that. So you want to be somewhat strategic with the naming of the show. All right. Well, when's this going to start?
I'm hoping it'll start sometime before the end of April or early May.
Oh, man. So you got to get rolling.
Yeah.
Very cool. Well,
I've got to start lining up interviews pretty soon.
Yeah. Do you have a budget?
Not right now. No, I need to talk to my ag advisor about that.
Okay. Well, I would say, what kind of computers are you using there?
Right now, our school's using Chromebook Max.
Chromebooks,
not Chromebooks Max. My bad.
Okay, that really threw me there for a second. Okay, so you're using...
Yeah, my brain went two different places.
You're using Chromebooks. So that's going to be a limiting factor, right? Because I don't think you're going to be able to put software on there like Adobe Audition. And I don't even know, does a Chromebook have a USB port?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, so if it does have that, you could plug in that mic we talked about. But in terms of putting software on there to run, like Adobe Audition, you might not be able to do that. And I got to tell you, audio files take a lot of storage. You're not going to be able to store that on a Chromebook. So you do need to get with your advisor because you need a mic and you need an upgrade or at least access to a better computer for sure. Well, that's great. I'm excited for you, Ashley. Really, really looking forward to it. I will be happy to share your podcast when it comes out. That would be really fun.
Perfect. That would be awesome.
Although you're going to go from being a guest to being a competitor. We're both going to be interviewing people about their SAEs.
I'll try not stepping on your toes too much.
Oh, I'd be happy to help you. That'd be really cool. Well, thank you for doing this today. I think it's a fun insight, and I was happy to be able to give you some advice while hopefully creating something our listeners like. So thanks very much for coming on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for having me. This has been an awesome opportunity in learning what I should do for my next steps.
Well, thank you for being here, everybody, and thank you again to Ashley Elsbernd for coming on the Off-Farm Income Podcast and taking a genuine interest in getting this started and making it happen. Really, really enjoyed that. And hey, we'd love to have you click that subscribe button down below and become a subscriber to our YouTube channel. And we'd also love to connect with you on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, all under the title Off-Farm Income. Everybody, until next time, enjoy your journey to the ultimate lifestyle business, agriculture.